Welcome to the Bail in the Midwest podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Bail in the Midwest podcast, where we explore a variety of topics related to bail, pretrial release, and the criminal justice system in the Midwest. My name is Shane Rolf. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Kansas Bail Agents Association, and I've worked in this field for the past 35 years. Now, in the novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, Oscar Wilde penned the famous quote that says, "A cynic is a man who knows the price of everything but the value of nothing." And so, by that logic, the so-called bail reformers must be the most cynical of people. Now, I've been told that a writer should limit his use of other people's quotes, especially when the quote is so famous as to become more or less a cliche. And I've seen this particular quote used in a variety of presentations where people will attempt to contrast price and value or make an argument that price is cheap for the value received. So I was hesitant to use it as an opening. But as I mentioned, the quote is from The Picture of Dorian Gray. And I think that in the context of bail reform, that metaphor actually works quite well. For those unfamiliar with the book, Dorian, knowingly or unknowingly, sells his soul to remain forever young, while his portrait will age in his place. Dorian then engages in all sorts of, let's just say, negative behavior and suffers no ill effects from his action, although the painting ages and suffers terribly, rendering Dorian's appearance in the painting to little more than a corpse over time. Applying the metaphor to bail, Dorian would play the role of the bail reformers, engaging in all kinds of harmful behavior, while the community at large would suffer the wounds borne by the painting. But we're not doing book club today. Rather, we're going to talk about the true economic cost of bail reform. So to follow the quote, do we know the price of doing away with secured bail? And more importantly, do we know the value or lack of value that results from bail reform? My guest today can help us answer these questions. Eric Granof is the Vice President of Corporate Communications for AIA Surety and has written extensively on this topic. Eric, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Shane.
Well, thank you for being here. Now, I always give my guests an opportunity to sort of toot their own horn and let us know how they came to be involved in bail. So kind of give us a little bit of your history and your CV. How did you wander into this little facet of the world that we're all in here?
First off, I'm still trying to decide if I wanted to be Dorian Gray or if I wanted to be the painting. And I'm kind of torn on which one. So anyway, no, I've been involved with AIA and working for them probably close to 20 years now. First kind of as a marketing person to kind of come in there and work with their agents and do some presentations at some of their conferences. And then, full-time for the last probably 14, 15 years as the head of marketing, head of corporate communications for them. And it's they probably get the same opening from everyone that's ever been in this business before. So it's not really something that they ever really thought they'd be in, but they kind of ended up in it. And you have this kind of love-hate affair with this business, is that it's super interesting, it's super important, yet for some reason everyone wants to end you and they want to use your tax dollars to do so. So it's a constant battle, but I think that over the years, I think our industry is very good at what we do. And I think when you are that good and you play the role that we do in the criminal justice system, that it's a lot easier to defend yourself, when your actions are so effective and, for lack of a better word, in my opinion, noble, in terms of that role we play.
Yeah, I agree. I very much, feel proud of what I do. I mean, it is important to make sure that people show up for court, address the charges against them, and then are also given an opportunity to be out while that's still ongoing, to where you're not, you don't have a jail that has 10,000 people in it in a county of, 400,000 people. Otherwise, if you have a high crime rate, those jails would explode without some other mechanism to get people out pending trial.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, if you think about it, I always kind of explain what bail is that, everyone has that image of the scales of justice, right? And that, the lady justice is blind. But on this scale, there has to always be a fulcrum, right? It's that middle point that balances what happens in the system. And what happens in the system is either people get detained or people get released. But you can't do just one or the other. There's got to be a balance of the two. And we really do sit in that middle area of, you can't lock up someone because you think they've done something when potentially they're innocent, and you can't let someone out when potentially they're pretty bad, pretty dangerous. So it's an interesting role for us to play and where we've ended up, and the use of money and the incentive and having someone that's on the hook for you, that just sits in this middle place as the perfect point of getting people to show up and be responsible and accountable, and yet maintaining the ability for people to get out and to defend themselves while their case is pending.
Well, and from a political standpoint, and I know I'm getting off script a little bit here, but the middle is kind of a tough place to be in the current environment. I mean, you have, on the left is let everybody go, and on the right is lock everybody up. And somehow we're in the middle. And while we think we're making a rational argument, that rational middle isn't always there when you're dealing with politics.
Well, it only took you about 3 minutes to say the word politics, so which is interesting, which is actually a long time in our business, because usually it's right off the bat there's some political issue that affects our existence or not,
Well, I'm also the legislative chair for the Kansas Bail Agents Association, so I tend to fall towards the political aspect of things. So I do want to do a pretty kind of deep dive on some of these issues of the real cost of bail reform. But first, I want to address a couple of sort of recurring tropes that we see a lot on this topic. And the first one is, when you're calculating costs, is the hotel room approach to jail cost calculation. In short, a jail or prison adds up all of its costs and divides that total by total inmates or average inmates per day, and then reaches some sort of per diem cost for housing prisoners. And in my area, that usually comes down to between $85 and $125 a day. Then the argument is made that if we can drop our average jail population by, say, 10 inmates, then we're saving $1,000 a day or $365,000 per year. And that comparison is used to justify bail reform. It's always a comparison with incarceration versus current forms of pretrial release like bail. But is this an accurate way to measure the theoretical cost savings associated with releasing a defendant from custody?
No, I think it's a false narrative. I think it sounds good, but anyone that understands economics understands the reality of, if you run a prison, that the majority of your costs are fixed costs. And they're not necessarily to the extent that they're saying variable costs. I mean, you have to still pay for the real estate. You still have to pay for the electricity. You have to pay for the water. You have to pay for the food, and you have to pay for all the guards, regardless of how many people are in that jail. And those costs are pretty fixed. So to sit there and say, I'm going to reduce my population and suddenly my costs have gone down, that's not necessarily such a simple thing. The calculation doesn't work that way. You literally have to close down wings of the jail. You have to lay off people. You have to reduce the amounts of all those fixed costs if you're really going to see any cost savings. And we know that doesn't happen. And the other thing it doesn't take into consideration is that it's really hard to, I think, come up with a kind of a static calculation of how many people are in a jail ongoing, because it really is just a snapshot in time, right? Because people are constantly moving in and out. And to sit there and say there's 10,000 people in the jail, whoop, no, now there's only 9,999. What? Now there's 10,001. Now there's 9 now. You can't accurately say that, because the idea is it is a cycling of people through the system. And that 10,000 that might be sitting there today, tomorrow is going to be a different group of people, because the people that have gotten out and people have gotten put in. So it's constantly changing, and they never take that into consideration when they're coming up with their talking points against us.
Yeah, but sadly, I do think this is an argument that many legislators, or I guess stakeholders, as we use the term these days, really buy into. My very first guest on the podcast was Stephen Owens, who I think
Yes.
who is now in the Kansas State Legislature. And one of the things they tried to impress upon him and all new legislators at their initial orientation when they come into any sort of legislative body is the concept of finite resources. Because, unlike the federal government, most state and local governments can't spend at a huge deficit. So when someone comes to them with the hotel room comparison and says they'll save them millions of dollars, it can be really hard to resist.
Yeah, but I'd like to think that, the people that get elected into these positions would think more realistically and more objectively than just sitting listening to what some activist tells them is the problem. Because you have to begin to think about, okay, well, let's save money by closing down some jails, but oh yeah, let's set up this group over here that's going to cost us tens of millions of dollars in order to manage that process. But at the end of the day, you find out you've actually spent more now creating this group when the jail system was operating fine the way it was. So, unfortunately, I've met very good legislators that get this, and I've met legislators that necessarily don't really want to understand it, because I think a lot of the decisions being made are being made ideologically and not necessarily based on fact or based on what's probably best for the majority of the people.
Well, on the other hand, though, I mean, if you have the argument of the hotel room cost of jail associated with it, can we not, as bail bondsmen, make that same argument in reverse? If it cost you $150 a day to hold someone in custody, and we have 200 people on bond, are we not saving you, $20,000-$30,000 a day for the people that we manage?
Yeah, no, it works until they start getting into their other argument on the flip side of the money, which is, I always talk about that the battle we fight isn't necessarily it's facts or financial. It really it's around heart and emotion, right? And so what they're going to say is, well, yeah, but you're making poor people pay to make up for that cost, and that's not fair that poor people are having to pay for bail when we could just be letting them out for free, and because they're just good people, and they only commit crimes because society has failed them, not because they're bad. But I mean, you start going down that path if you begin to go tit for tat with them on the hotel model, as you've called it. And that's what we've seen. We've seen this discussion really evolve. I mean, it's always really been focused around that money and the cost. And you don't really hear a lot of that anymore. You really hear it's just about that it's unfair. And we're dealing, and I think from their standpoint it was really smart. Let's move it away from facts and let's move it into emotion, because you don't have facts with emotion. It's unfair, right? You have to, I think from our standpoint, we always like to bring it back to the money, because I think that's the tangible thing where we hopefully people can make decisions. But they've moved it into this world of emotion and feelings, and it's a really hard place for us to be in today's current climate, for sure.
Yeah, very understandable. The other sort of, I don't want to say trope, but the other sort of argument that you hear on these things, like kind of covers, and I think it'll kind of segue nicely in some of the main topics here, is during the riots, or rather the mostly peaceful protests, if I can't call them riots, of 2020, one of the ways that wanton criminal behavior was excused was with the statement, well, they've got insurance, so we shouldn't care that stores are being looted and burned because they've got insurance and everything will be fine. So is insurance, when small businesses actually have insurance, or even large businesses, is that a panacea to mass criminal behavior?
There's never ever an excuse that you should ever say that it's okay for someone to commit a crime. To basically say the new norm is we just have to let these people commit crimes because somehow we're making up something for them that we've taken from them in the past, or whatever you want to call it. Who knows if insurance even covers half the things that are happening during the riots. It all depends on their policies they have, right? So you can't just say that insurance is a panacea. But I think this goes to a bigger topic and a deeper topic, and it's an example that I give a lot when I give this presentation to state associations a lot. Is that the argument is always made that, well, he just stole something small from this guy, right? And he's just trying to feed his family, or he's just stealing that big screen TV from Walmart because he's just trying to feed his family, when I'm pretty sure Walmart sells bread, and it would probably be a lot easier just to steal food if you wanted to feed your family. But, I give an example of a plumber, right? So this guy's got a set of tools and they're in his truck gets broken into, And the other side will always say, well, he just stole some tools because he wanted to sell it and get food for his family. They never, basically taking the concept of victim off of the plumber and really putting it on the criminal, right? Because this guy's hungry and we should feel bad that we've made him have to resort to crime to feed his family. But meanwhile, you have a plumber now who doesn't have a set of tools, right? So, his truck got broken into, so probably his car rates are going to go up and his insurance rates are going to go up because he had insurance on that. The tools were maybe his grandfather's tools. They don't even make those tools anymore. So what is he supposed to do about that? He's got to go get a new set of tools that are probably less quality. They're probably more expensive. He didn't get to fix Mrs. Jones's sink that day. Now Mrs. Jones is upset. So what does she do? She goes on Google, does a negative review, and now this plumber suddenly starts losing jobs and doesn't show up well on Google because he has negative reviews. Meanwhile, he doesn't, so when you begin to think about this, and this is kind of where I get into it with stuff in terms of the cost of bail reform, a lot of these costs are not really quantifiable, right? There's a cascading set of things that happens here that this poor plumber who's been victimized now has to deal with all these costs, both emotional costs, financial costs, and no one's ever really thought about these things and put that number on it, other than the fact that this criminal is doing this and we're supposed to try to justify this crime to make it seem like it's okay. It's really kind of strange that we're in this place as a society that we've got, that we're saying we're okay with crime as the new norm.
Well, I think I have some thoughts on that as well, and I'll get into that theory I have on that here just a little later. But before we get too far down there, let's kind of talk about how we got to where we are now. My personal thought is that the Ferguson riots, even though they were based upon the hands up, don't shoot lie, seem to have been a turning point, both politically and in terms of proactive policing. The Obama administration, through Eric Holder, began an outright attack on bail and an attack on the police. And then George Floyd simply poured gasoline on that fire. So what are some of the pro-crime or lenient actions that they, and I mean they, the government or the activists, have done since Ferguson's, and have these actions lowered or increased overall crime?
Well, I even think it take a step further. I absolutely think that the Obama administration was probably a starting point for a lot of this. But even before Ferguson, you had Eric Holder immediately when he came into office discredit the research that had been done for decades before. Every year the Bureau of Justice Statistics, or the Department of Justice, would always do a study at the 75 largest metropolitan cities in the country, and they would take a look at their release mechanisms, and it would be everything from free release to 10% release to surety bonds release to cash release, and they would compare how each one did. And for as long as they ever did the study, surety bail, release on a surety bond, was the most effective way to ensure someone showed up for court. And the research showed this, and we used it everywhere to great effect. And the first action that Holder did, or one of the first, was to say that research couldn't be used to say that one mechanism was better than the other. Okay, he didn't say the research was wrong in the result. He just says you couldn't use it. So you have this step being taken to say, okay, there's no more facts. We've gotten rid of these facts. Now let's go ahead and let's start tapping into the emotion of people. Let's start tapping into this, poor person was gunned down viciously by police without it allowed them to tell a story that they wanted to tell. And meanwhile, you get legislators deciding that, there's too many people in jail. Activists are bringing up all these issues at all their legislative meetings. And so what now we have to do is we have to say, okay, well, if you go into a store and you steal something, we're going to go ahead and raise the amount of that crime. So if you steal $100 worth of goods, that's no longer a crime. We're going to say you can steal up to $1,000 worth of goods. So what you basically done now is saying anyone can go and do whatever they want up to $1,000. So I can go steal $990 worth of goods, and it's no longer really a crime. It's a slap on the wrist misdemeanor. Or you do what California did, and you pass Prop 47, which decriminalized a lot of really bad felonies and turn them into misdemeanors. It doesn't mean that they're not bad crimes anymore, but they want the perception to be that this is okay, and that certain maybe populations in our communities can go ahead and do things. And what are we supposed to do about it? We're supposed to take it and be okay with it. San Francisco, car crimes go up. So what's their solution? Make it look like your car already got broken into, so you won't get broken into. Or you know what? If you're going to go out with your wife, don't have her wear her wedding ring. She shouldn't be wearing something like that because she's just making herself a target. So they've suddenly turned it on the law-abiding people to say that you shouldn't live your life normally. You have to live it in the context of knowing that this crime is going to happen because we're just going to let it happen.
But we're not going to lower your taxes on the money we're not spending to protect you.
Oh, yeah, no. But that money is now going to criminal support groups, defendant support groups. It no longer goes to victim advocacy groups. I'm friends with several victim advocates who no longer get public funding or very little of it. It's all transferred over to this other side of defendant services, which is a fancy way of just saying benefits for the criminals.
So decriminalization is one of the things that they've done in response to this. I know that you talked about how that they're releasing people on misdemeanor citation. So really there's, what are the consequences associated with not going to court for that citation in the certain jurisdictions? I know that in my area, the municipal courts and municipal can only charge misdemeanors. So we don't see any of those as bonds until there's a failure to appear. Even people that live out of state, they generally don't have to post bond until they've already missed court at least once, maybe more than once.
Yep.
And then you have the notion of zero bail and free release programs where they're just, even when you are charged with a felony, are they cycling people right back out again on those things?
Yeah, I mean, what ends up happening is, first off, with law enforcement, I mean, this is another side of the story, right? I mean, we're talking about bail, but you get law enforcement with what happened after Ferguson, after Floyd. You get cops now that are demonized. And, why in the world would a cop put himself out there and maybe make an arrest or maybe stop someone from doing something when he knows that there's a really good chance that if something were to ever go sideways, or if he has to use any type of force, that's going to be turned into something against this guy. And so what you have is, even though it might be a misdemeanor crime, cops aren't going to even take the chance of going in and arresting anybody. So that's why arrests are down in a way, but we see the crime going up. And the other side will say, look, arrests are down, we're doing great, all these programs and policies are working. But the reality is it really isn't, because people are scared to death to even maybe say there was a crime committed, or they just stop asking the police to come anymore at all because they know they're not going to. And not only because people don't want to, but it's the resources aren't there. Cities like New Orleans were supposed to have 2,500 cops on patrolling the city, have about 450 cops patrolling the city right now. So you have all this stuff kind of contributing to this this just lack of, or this just explosion of lawlessness, and we're all just supposed to kind of accept it, and move on. So
let's just get one definition down here. I think we can probably both agree that to some degree or another, bail reform has caused an increase in crime. I mean, there's all these other factors as well: the pullback from the police department, progressive district attorneys, a decriminalization, an accepting attitude towards crime, I guess. But bail reform has caused an increase in crime.
100%. If anyone says anything different, they're putting their head in the hole so that they don't have to accept it. I don't know how you could make that comment that it hasn't affected it. I mean, it's like you push a button over here, something happens over here, and you're trying to say that that's not related. I mean,
well, I know that in New York City, they enacted their bail reform right at the beginning of 2020. So right at the beginning of the year in 2020, they, started releasing everybody and their dog, and then saw crime immediately explode. And even Bill de Blasio, who is functionally a communist, I think, seemed to admit as much in early March of 2020 when he said that nothing else had changed other than the bail to cause the explosion in crime that he saw since the beginning of the year. And so there was an argument at that time that maybe they were going to look at rolling that back because it was a single factor issue at the time.
Yep.
Of course, what else happened in March of 2020 is that, COVID came along. And so now everything that we can blame on COVID gets blamed on COVID. And bail reform, it couldn't possibly be bail reform. It's got to be COVID. Is the reason why all this crime is gone. Now, I'm not saying that COVID doesn't contribute to that, but until you had COVID to put that across, even the far left was starting to admit that, hey, this was a problem.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's hard to ignore it when it's interesting. I talk about this all the time. So, when I first got into this business, and you've been in it longer than I have, when did you ever hear bail or the word anything with our industry on television, on the news as an issue? You never heard it. Maybe Dog the Bounty Hunter would do something, or maybe there'd be a very high profile case, but you never heard it. In the last 4 to 5 years, and I would say even now, I mean, you can't turn television on tonight without turning on any news program and just watch that for 30 minutes and you will hear the word bail reform. Okay? Tell me that it's not connected to everything that's going on in the world right now. I mean, it literally was the ignition point, in my opinion, of all the crime that we're seeing now. And it started happening about a decade ago. And I think we are seeing the results of it sounds conspiracy, but it's almost like it was a well-coordinated effort to put us in this position that we are nowadays. And it's kind of scary because I think you see some things coming out of this where you now have states like Wisconsin that have just passed laws. I mean, the people were willingly giving up their constitutional rights and they're allowing preventative detention. I mean, you have state legislatures looking at preventative detention as an option now. And people think, oh, that sounds great. Let's lock up the bad guys. But listen, I mean, there's a very fine line between when you give someone that ability and what they're going to do with it. I mean, do we get to the point where maybe they don't like who you voted for, or now suddenly you're going to be so you can't, and our country's been very smart about that. At least our founding fathers were, about putting these things and checks and balances and all these things in place. But for the people to get so fed up with crime to willingly give up something that is a pretty important part of our freedoms, it gets pretty scary where this potentially goes.
Well, and then look at both New Mexico and New Jersey. While it wasn't used that way, that was how it was sold when they made their constitutional amendment changes to allow preventative detention and more lenient release for people who weren't preventatively detained. The way they sold that to the public, and the reason the public came out and voted for it, was because they thought they were going to be preventively detaining a larger percentage of people than they actually are.
Yeah, no, but it's sold as that way, but you have a limited number, at least at the state level, of how many people you can house. Whereas I think the Fed has more options, but the states, you have jails and then or prisons, and then that's it, and then you have to be able to manage those populations. And so you begin to locking up a lot of people. What ends up happening is you have to release everyone that you think is less dangerous than the violent ones. And what people don't realize, and the part of the story is told, is that the people that are actually in these jails now, I mean, especially, California, they are the worst of the worst. I mean, the narrative that's thrown around is that, 60, 70% of the people are in jail and they're only there because they can't afford a bail bond. That does not exist in California and a lot of other states now. California, they took, because of AB 109, the realignment, they took all these convicted bad guys, and because the prisons were crowded, moved them down into the county jails. And so everyone that was in the county jails had to go somewhere where you had to release them.
Right.
So this is all part of the equation that leads to more crime, less safe streets, and all this stuff that we're seeing now. Because, I think the LA County Jail is, of their pretrial population, I think 95% of the people in the pretrial population are there on felony crimes. So when they say that people are there on low-level first-time misdemeanors, drug offense, it doesn't happen in California. They are released immediately. They are given a citation, or here's your court date, and then when they don't show up, the stack of warrants just gets higher and higher and higher and higher. And typically, maybe they get caught when they get caught committing another crime. I mean, that's really the only way they ever catch these people. But I mean, it's what we touched on earlier, this whole decriminalization and the realignment and moving, you know, and it makes you really begin to think as someone outside, even if you and I weren't in the bail industry, what's going on? Like, why are we doing it? Why are we, you know, wouldn't a better option to be, if people are going to jail, maybe we take a look at teaching them not to do things that get them to go to jail. Start at our schools, start with families, but for some reason we think, let's focus on the back end, let people out, tell them what they did wasn't a crime, and they're just going to say, oh, thanks, we're going to go ahead and live good lives. It doesn't work that way, and we're seeing the result of that.
Well, and this is, I think I've seen a progression since I've been doing this. It used to be, it was very difficult to convict someone. But once you were convicted, well, then you were going to serve some time. And so we've sort of backed off. Well, it's not as difficult to convict you anymore, but we're just going to put you on probation. And so you've seen this progression as you're moving up the chain in the criminal justice system. Well, yeah, I know we're just going to put you on probation. And then, you know, so as we become more focused on different aspects of it, it used to be like the prosecutor's office didn't really care about the pretrial portion of it. Hey, this is your bond, post the bond, good. We're concerned about getting conviction and making you serve time. You just make sure the guy shows up to address those charges. And if we need to send him off to prison, we'll do that. Now you find them much more involved in the pretrial, you know, aspect of things. I think largely because they don't have the harsh option at the end of the line that they used to have. You have so many cases that are presumptive probation cases now that you don't get to, you don't get to get your pound of flesh out of them as a prosecutor at the end of the stage. And so you're trying to work on whatever deterrence you're trying to get out of that prosecution. You're trying to get that on the front end of the case because it doesn't exist to the same degree on the back end of the case.
You've also had the prosecution be put in a spotlight for the first time, right? They've been put in a spotlight in a way that they've never had before, because you have the introduction of these rogue district attorneys now around the country that are treating the DA's office like a public defender's office now. And so I think that's opened everyone's eyes to taking a look at DAs all over the country. And I think that they feel that pressure a little bit now, more of whether they're going to have someone come into their race next time they're up for election. That's one of these kind of Soros DAs. And so I think they're less likely. I mean, everyone's kind of like walking on eggshells, I would say, is probably a good way to describe it in these DA offices now. And the guys who are supposed to be the ones that are standing between us and the criminals and prosecuting it, they don't have the tools anymore. They have too much of a pressure and spotlight, and they have I think a legislature around them and a system around them that's trying to soften things that really doesn't give them a hammer to hit anyone over the head with anymore. You know, I know you've probably talked with Jeff Clayton about this, and he says this all the time, is that the two most effective ways for your criminal justice system to work is the swiftness and the severity of the punishment. Those have been proven time and time again to be the most effective ways, or effective things within a criminal justice system to get people to stop committing crimes, to rehabilitation and all that stuff. And we've lost both of those in our system today, is that there is no swiftness. And that typically probably is the biggest problem with the criminal justice. It's not bail reform. It's the fact that we can't get people through the system fast enough. And so you're releasing people that shouldn't be because you can't detain them, or you're detaining them and you're overcrowding jail. So if you could get people through the system in the way you're supposed to, which is I think in most states it's supposed to be like 48 hours or maybe 72 hours, I don't know. And like you said, you've taken away the stick. How do you manage a group of the population that wants to go out and take advantage of everybody else at that point? It becomes very difficult to do so.
The other third aspect of that, I know that Jeff didn't touch on that in some of his talks, but it was touched on in Thinking About Crime by John Q. Wilson, was the certainty of punishment. So if you were certain that you were going to get caught, well, there was less likelihood that you were engaged in. And that goes more towards the law enforcement side, the proactive policing side, smart policing where you've got officers in high crime areas to where, well, there's more of a chance I'm going to get caught if I pull this thing here. So I'm just not going to do that.
Yep.
So it certainly was a big aspect of that as well. So let's actually get into some of the cost here. We've been kind of talking around all this stuff, but what the cost of wholesale bond reform or bail reform. While we hate to sound like bean counters because that has a negative connotation to it, counting the beans is a legitimate way to generate public policy. Again, most places have finite resources to dedicate to different topics, so trade-offs have to be made. It's just vital when we're making those decisions that the trade-offs are based upon accurate information. So this is your bailiwick here. Tell us, what is the accurate info? What happens when you eliminate secured bail? What are the costs? And how do we calculate those? Because I know we've kind of danced around some of it, but maybe, just focus on some of that.
I mean, I think we dance around it because I think the answer is really difficult to pin down. I mean, I think, if you look back in the history of our government, taking a look at crime and its impact on our country really only started, 60, 70 years ago, maybe 60, 70, 80, 90 years ago. But, it was never something that was really formulated or really anyone really thought about. And even today, the way we take a look at crime and measure crime, it's done in such isolation and such different boxes, right? You've got, one group within the government will take a look at these types of crimes, and one group in the government takes a look at these types of crimes, and this various group only takes a look at self-reported crimes. And so we know the accuracy of that's going to be bad because not every crime is reported. Even NCIC only has, I think, about 40% of the stuff that's supposed to go into NCIC ever gets into NCIC. So our data gathering has never been great as a country or as a society. That we definitely need improvements on, because we need cross coordination. We need single databases that take a look at everything so that we can have a better understanding of the types of crimes that are happening, the costs of those crimes that are happening. And then there's, like, if you look at the science around calculating that number, right? Because it's easy when everyone wants that clean number. It just makes a much better story. It's really hard to get there because there's so many ways to look at it, right? I mean, you go back to that plumber story. How do you truly calculate all those things that I talked about? Like, how do you put a dollar value on the fact that this guy has a young daughter who knows that this guy's truck or garage got broken into, who can't sleep at night now, that he now has to think about, I have to move houses because my daughter being in this house makes her feel unsafe, or his health issues now because he's having heart issues because he's stressed out all the time about how he's going to make his business. How do you really put a cost on that? And I think that's why it makes it so difficult, right? Because I think there are so many things, and as I mentioned, it's this cascading thing that, I mean, a crime's committed against me, yet my neighbor's affected by it. How do you put a cost on that? I mean, so it's a really difficult thing to do. And when I was doing some research on this, I found all these different scientific that were, way beyond anything I was ever going to understand, statistics. But I found this chart, and even on that chart, if you use these 5 different methods from these 5 genius statisticians, and they try to come up with, say, the cost of a murder, right? Like, how do you put a cost on murder? All 5 of them were different numbers, right? And so it's like the cost of aggravated assault. All 5 had different numbers. So it really is hard to pinpoint that number. But the numbers I did find online, back in 1999, that number, I think it was 49 million crimes were committed. It was $1.7 trillion was the cost that they came up with crime. Okay. So that's what, 24 years ago. Right. And if you were to probably look at, I think the next number was like 2017. They talked that number had grown to about 120 million crimes. So almost 2.5, 3 times what it was. And it's about 2.6 trillion, I think, was the number they gave. And that's 17 years later. And then even 2021, I think, was the last number. So it's 4 years ago. So you go from 2.6, the estimate for 2021 was 4.9 trillion. So you can see that it's a substantial number. A lot of people, when you say trillion, it's really hard to kind of comprehend that number. And so I take people through an exercise a lot. I'll show them, like, here's a $100 bill, right? And then here's what $10,000 looks like. Here's what a million, and you get to what $1 trillion would be. So imagine a pallet, okay, a full pallet. Everyone knows, like, when a forklift, lifts up the wood pallets, filled with $100 bills, okay? And then you imagine a football field filled with a layer of pallets filled with $100 bills. Well, imagine that, and then imagine another layer put on top of that first layer. So 2 layers of pallets of $100 bills covering a football field. That's what $1 trillion looks like. And you're talking $4.9 trillion is the estimate of cost of crime just 2 years ago.
Well, and I could be wrong. I haven't looked at these numbers in a while, but isn't US GDP only about 20 trillion?
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking 25% of the national GDP.
It's more than what our country spends on healthcare.
Oh yeah, or pretty much anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's unbelievable, and it's a number that I almost feel like they don't want to calculate it. Maybe that's why it's so amorphous. But it's substantial. I mean, and you begin to think about, what could we be doing if we weren't wasting that kind of money, or crime wasn't taking that much out of our economy? What could we really do as a society and a community?
Well, you have talked about, in some of the stuff I've read that you've written, is what you refer to as the domino effect, and what I've talked about, as basically reverse broken windows. The broken windows policy, and the domino effect is essentially the reverse of that. And so you stop enforcing law, or you start cycling people back out. And we talked about crime's allowed to proliferate. You decriminalize, so we don't necessarily call it crime, but it still has the same functional effect on people. Communities become less safe. I mean, I'm seeing that more in my area. There was, somebody was killed outside my office by the police, 2 days ago, who decided to come attack the officer with a knife. And there's homeless people that live behind my office. And so you see these pictures from San Francisco, which is not my area. I'm in the middle of the country, but you've got open air drug markets and homeless encampments, and people can't go to. You talked about San Francisco. People have to disguise their cars like they were broken into beforehand. There's needles and stuff all over the streets.
They actually have an app that tells you where the human defecation is. It's called the Poop app in San Francisco. I mean, that's literally like how bad it's gotten. I mean, and I lived in San Francisco for 2.5 years. I worked in Union Square, right off Maiden Lane, and it used to be one of the best places to be in the city. And now it's like, it's a war zone down there. And it's unfortunate, because what it does is it drives the economy out, right? You have Nordstrom that's been there for I don't know how many decades. They're leaving, there. You got Walgreens, you got CVS, you got Starbucks, you have all these stores that just decide they can't operate in these environments. And then what begins to happen to these communities, right? Because remember, bail reform is always being done under the, for my opinion, under the guise of helping these communities of color, helping these communities of less fortunate communities, right? And what happens? These are the communities that are impacted most negatively by all this stuff, right? CVS, you decrease the level of what's a crime, or the level of shoplifting, or increase the amount you can do without it being a crime. And what happens to all the retailers? Well, CVS decides, I'm going to pull out of this neighborhood because I can't afford to do business anymore. Now, everyone that lives in that neighborhood has no more access to drugs, has no more access to the things that these stores sell: grocery stores, pharmaceutical or drug stores, hardware stores. They're all going to be gone. And then what happens? These communities are going to get worse and worse and worse off if we can't control the crime in them. And letting people out of jail for free and forgiving crimes is not the approach to do that.
Well, and then, a couple of points on that. One is, as businesses leave, how do you recover from that as a city? If you wanted to crack down on crime, where does the money come from to pay for the extra police? I mean, your tax revenue is gone. When these businesses leave, how do you get more funding to recover?
Yeah, but it's not even the businesses anymore, though, right? I mean, McDonald's, I read some article, McDonald's built a beautiful brand new headquarters in Illinois, in Chicago, and they can't get their employees to show up for work because it's too dangerous to commute to work. I mean, at what point do people are just going to open their eyes and wake up to really what's going on around us? And I mean, that takes it to a whole new level, right? It's not only the stores not being able to operate, but you get corporate headquarters now not being able to have employees go. I mean, the economy's got to begin to break down at some point where it's like we got to figure something out, right? I mean, and you can't just. I mean, always talk about like there's this pendulum, right? And we've gotten so far to the left. And I'm only saying left just because I swung my left hand out, not necessarily maybe Freudian, I don't know. But that it swung so far in one direction of just letting everybody out, having no punishment, it's nobody's fault, to the fear then becomes it swings all the way back the other way, and we just start locking everybody up. And I think that's the danger zone that we're kind of in now. Is it's almost, yeah, it's bad what's happening, but what's going to be really bad is if we let this thing swing too bad in the other direction, because I think that opens up a whole new can of worms that our country or societies haven't dealt with in many years. And I don't think we want to go there. And once again, as we started off the conversation, as that pendulum swings, who sits there right in the middle, right? It's us. And we got to prevent that pendulum from swinging too far in one direction.
I want to throw a couple of theories at you, of just kind of my thoughts on why we're in this position we are now. And you feel free to shoot those down because there's just my theories on here. Heather McDonald, who writes a lot about criminal justice issues from a very data-driven perspective, and she's written the book The War on Cops, and her most recent book is called The Diversity Delusion: How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture. She really does need a shorter title than that.
Yeah.
But in a recent interview, she stated that if there wasn't a racial disparity in criminal activity, then we as a society, quote, wouldn't give a damn, unquote, about things like mass incarceration and cashless bail. It's only when we look at these things through a racial lens do we see a problem. And I think that folds nicely into sort of a two-part theory that I have about why we do give a damn. And one, and again, like I said, feel free to shoot these down, it's the notion, and this is more of a pejorative anymore than it used to be, is the limousine liberals, for lack of a better term, which is to say wealthier, college-educated white people don't really have any contact with minority communities and think that because of white supremacy or the legacy of slavery or some such thing that minorities then don't have any choice but to engage in crime, and often view lenient pro-crime policies as beneficial to minority communities. So the second one theory, and they sort of mesh together, is what I call, and you sort of referenced this earlier, is the Les Mis or Les Miserables understanding of crime. That's the argument that people are committing crimes to feed their families, using Jean Valjean and his stolen bread as an example. And so if you have this well-educated, well-off population that's not really necessarily exposed to crime, things like, the play, Les Miserables, is all they're seeing about these things. But I think this, as you mentioned before, represents a misunderstanding of who makes up the population of our jails and prisons. And they're not food thieves and friendly stoners. So obviously the people that are pushing these reforms, they mean well, at least from their perspective. But I'm curious about if you think those are the sorts of things that are driving some of this push to implement bail reform policy, or, I mean, is it a well-meaning mistake, or is it something more nefarious?
I think a lot of the stuff we hear is a distraction. I mean, I think they're trying to tap into the well-meaningness of people, because inherently, I think I do believe that all people are good to a point, and I think that all people don't want people to suffer. They don't want, you know, we'll get political here, I guess, because we just will. I think I've got lots of friends that lean left. Okay. I think there's no question that most people that know me know where I stand on the spectrum. But I think for the most part, 95% of the things that are important to the operation of the world in general is that all of us would agree. Left, right, whatever you are on the spectrum. Okay. We all want our government to be fiscally responsible. We all want our government to protect us from foreign nations and bad things should they ever happen. We all want to have roads that work and all those different things, infrastructure. And no one wants poor people languishing away and dying in the streets. You could say that every Democrat and every Republican and every independent and every Green Party member, they would all agree on those things, because those are the most basic things that we all need to survive, and that we all, at the end of the day, as a society, interact with and have to have operating for us to be able to live lives in a peaceful way. And I think what our political parties do is they never focus on those things. They focus on those things very high level. But what we've gone to is the fringes. We've gone to whatever's far right and whatever's far left, and that's all we hear nonstop. And it makes everyone who is on the same page in the middle begin to pull away from each other. And I think we've been separated purposefully or non-purposely or whatever. I mean, I don't want to get into conspiracy, but there's a reason it's happening. Is that, I mean, 10 years ago, you could have debate with someone. You can't have a debate with anybody anymore. Why? We're the same people. We're the same. Right. And at the end of the day, like I said, 95% of what we think, we're in agreement, but we don't even talk about those things anymore. We're only focused on the fringe thing. So I think it's I think it's a distraction of false narratives that's being done while there's a group or someone that is trying to achieve something, whether it's to create the chaos so that we don't see what's going on in this hand while this hand's, I mean, who knows what the reason is? I mean, I wish I knew, because it confuses me a lot. But it's interesting. So I'll give you an example of something, and I kind of don't know if it makes sense or not, but it's interesting to me. So my family, for some reason, maybe this was a COVID thing, we got into watching Survivor, right? And for everyone that maybe you do or don't know, it's all these people are on this island. They put them into different groups, whatever, and then the idea is to outwit, outplay, outlast, whatever.
Right.
And so the one we're watching right now is Gen X versus Millennial. And I had a conversation with my family the other night, because we're talking about, oh, the Gen X are doing this or the Millennials are doing this. And the way that, my perception of this was that it's a distraction. The two categories of Gen X and Millennials are a total distraction for that game, because what it tries to do is to get you to go into one group or the other and to create an alliance in one group or the other, right? But as you watch the game play on, what ends up happening is that people that are from different groups end up forming alliances. And to me, the producers of the show want the players to fall into those two groups because it's more confrontational. But the second you get these groups working together, that's where the game becomes more in control of the players than the producers. And I think that the bail reform argument, I think, very much plays in that way, and our political environment plays in that way, is that it wants to create the conflict because it keeps things away from people figuring things out. I don't know. Anyway, maybe it's a good example, maybe it's a bad example, but.
Well, and Survivor is famous for creating those sorts of controversies to fight amongst themselves. I did have this sort of noted as just a side note to discuss if we had more time. So I'll kind of touch on it now, because I think it kind of fits in some of the issues we're having criminal justice wise in bail reform is the idea of cell phones and social media. Increasingly, what you're seeing in the news now is story after story about how social media and cell phones are damaging society by increasing loneliness, separating people out, and increasing depression among young people and stoking disagreement. Recent Facebook whistleblower alleged that Facebook was intentionally stirring up passions on a variety of hot button issues, inflating those issues in order to increase engagement on their platform. One of the concerns about TikTok is that they have the ability to do the same thing. And of course, they're a foreign actor. Now, these same phenomena, though, are having a negative impact, in my opinion, on criminal justice. In Ferguson, hands up, don't shoot, as I mentioned earlier, which was a lie, had proliferated across social media within hours of Michael Brown's death. And the cell phone video of George Floyd led to billions of dollars in peaceful damage. And the rise of the defund the police movement, the rise of Black Lives Matter, the rise of bail funds, being well funded more so than they were before. And would these events had the same sort of impact broadly had it not been social media and cell phones?
But what was the message with social media and cell phones were sold as it was going to make us all better. It was going to make us all more friendly with each other. It was going to open your social world. It was going to make, and what did it do? Exactly what you said, the complete opposite. It isolated people. It made people feel more lonely, and we were told that it was the opposite. So it's interesting that that happens, right? But I think that, the media in this country, in my opinion, has let us down. And when I say media, I think of all those things as media, right? I think that they've got one job. Okay, their one job is to hold the people in elected offices accountable. Okay, and that's not happening anymore. And I think what's happening is social media has infiltrated its it's years ago, Disney bought ABC, I think it was. I think it was the first one, right?
Right.
And it was the first entertainment company, truly entertainment, that moved into the news world. I think that's what it was. But I remember at that point thinking this is kind of interesting. Is what's going to happen to news, right? News was about information, and it quickly became about entertainment. And I think you lose the kind of Walter Cronkite, just the facts kind of stuff, an emotionless reading of just stories. But I think that social media has helped proliferate things that aren't necessarily true in a big way. Even just video footage that you can take with a cell phone out of context tells an incorrect story, right? And we've seen that happen before. If you don't catch that first 5 seconds or that last 5 seconds, it could change everything. And I think, we've come too much to rely on the speed of the story, the instantaneousness of information, as opposed to the correctness of the information. And I think as a society, that's a big problem. But I agree with you 100%. I think in terms of our issue in terms of bail reform, it has played a huge role in, I think, spreading misinformation about us. But I think we've done a good job in responding and using social media to help fight the fight that we fight, and to help use it to get consumers to send messages to legislators and around issues and their elected representatives and things like that.
No, so maybe it's not as bad as we all think, but we'll wrap it up here, and we'll give you a chance to scare us a little bit more here. And I'll read from an article that you wrote. So, quote, as failure to appear rates have risen, more defendants have failed to show up for court without consequences, and case backlogs have become unmanageable. This has forced the courts to dismiss cases in an effort to prevent the collapse of the criminal justice system. Now, and unquote. Now, I'm of the opinion that the criminal justice system is one of the pillars that supports an organized society. You have to have laws. You have to have enforcement of those laws. If you don't, your society breaks down. How do we continue to exist as a nation when we're allowing our major cities to descend into functional anarchy? And is that what's happening? Am I correct in that? And if so, how do we as a society walk back from that ledge?
I mean, that's the $1 million question, right? Because I think it's hard for anyone to sit there and look at what's going on right now and say there's not a problem in the system. I mean, we're a country that was founded on laws. And I think there's lots of these laws now that are just they're not being treated like laws. They're not suggestions. And I think there's a part of the society that thinks that these are just suggestions. And what scares me is when the people that believe that get into positions of power in the system, when they become judges, when they become lawyers, because you see that's the kind of the wave of the future. Of these are the people that are in law school now are the ones that are going to be in charge of our criminal justice system 20 years from now or 10 years from now. They're going to be judges. They're going to be, and if they're being taught that our laws are merely suggestions, that's a problem. And we can see examples of this all over the place. Now, plenty of judges that are great. There's plenty of lawyers, but when I go to UCLA and I sit in a panel and I see their law school students snapping their fingers when they don't like something that somebody said or when they feel triggered, or when I see stories about Supreme or federal court or federal judges going to present at a law school and having law school students protest a federal judge, to me, that's a red flag. Is it a red flag signaling the collapse of our criminal justice system? I don't know if it's that extreme, but it scares me to think that we've done the things we've done to this point, and then I look at the horizon and I see what's out there and what's about to happen with this influx of a population of law students that I think are being taught that the law is merely a suggestion. It worries me. I mean, I think it's frightening, but I have confidence in society. I have hope that people wake up and see these things that are happening, because nobody wants it. I mean, it's really going to be, people will stand up and fight when they've got nothing left to lose. And I think that we get close to a point where people are going to start realizing what's going on around them and they don't like it.
Well, and as you mentioned before, the issue of the backlash, the pendulum swinging the other way, and do you have, a much more authoritarian response to that? I mean, if you look at the old book or movie Clockwork Orange, I mean, you had all the thugs running wild in the street, and then they sent Alex off to prison. When he gets out, his old buddies were actually the police at that time. And so they had they just drew from those same people and had a much more violent and aggressive crackdown from the police department. So then you obviously you're going to swing back the other way in response to that, but nothing good happens during that swing.
No, and that's a problem. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is, the swing's been happening. It's happened over and over again. We've witnessed the swing back and forth throughout the history of the country.
Sure.
I think what is different about this swing is that I believe the pendulum has been propped up by amounts of money that we have never seen before in the system, where the pendulum swings and then common sense would always bring it back. And I think the pendulum has swung, and it's trying to come back, but there's a big stack of money in the way from these special interest groups and these activists and all this that's really kept it there longer than it needs to. And then I think once it maybe breaks through, that's where I think you're going to have that momentum, and hopefully cooler heads prevail somewhere in the middle when we realize that the solution isn't the opposite of what we're doing. It's to do the middle part better.
That's a tough argument to make. I mean, we saw the Bail Reform Act of 1984 and then the Salerno case afterwards, where the Supreme Court basically walked back your right to bail, to basically say that, well, you only have a right to non-excessive bail, and zero bail is not non-excessive. And that, I mean, granted, 5-4 decision, but still, because of the explosion in crime that happened from the Bail Reform Act in 1966, and you saw violent crime explode for 25, 30 years straight. And then, Congress decided to do something when that was the Bail Reform Act to try and roll that back and be able to hold people without bail. Well, when that was challenged, the Supreme Court's like, maybe we ought to be able to lock these people up. I mean, you walked away from a constitutional guarantee of bail to, well, there's only a federal constitutional guarantee to non-excessive bail. So, I mean, I guess my concern is it's tough to land back in that middle ground when you have a backlash.
Yeah, no, and I think that's going to be the challenge, right? I mean, how far do we correct? And
Well,
hopefully we do correct, because I think, like what you said about social media, how many people don't even think anything's even going on? I mean, there's people out there being told, I mean, there's articles being written that say there's no connection, that crime isn't as bad as they're saying.
right.
And that's the social media, that's the misinformation, that's the stuff that gets spread around when, I think it's pretty visible of that our communities are not the same that they were a decade ago.
Well, hopefully, and I'll sort of paraphrase Ken Good here, who does another podcast, The Bail Post, where he was talking to one of the Dorian Grays, to use my example earlier, and saying, you'll be gone from here, and I'll be the one cleaning up the mess. And of course, he just in his Dorian Gray fashion laughed and walked away. But hopefully, we will all be here to help clean up this mess when it's all said and done.
No, I know I'll be here.
Thank you very much, Eric, for taking the time to talk to us today. It was really illuminating. I appreciate you talking to me today.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks a lot, Shane.
Our thanks today to our guest, Eric Granof. He did a great job of showing how there are downstream costs associated with changes to bail procedures. Hopefully, this sheds light on the cost of bail reform. We should all pay close attention to the unintended, or more importantly, the intended consequences of these sorts of changes. Please join us next time for more discussions about bail in the Midwest.
Join us again next time for the Bail in the Midwest podcast.